Hello from Ukraine, you're watching Channel 24. My name is Andriy Drozda, and our guest today is Nataliya Bugaiova. She is a non-resident Russia fellow at the Institute for the Study of War. Her work focuses mainly on the Kremlin's foreign policy decision-making, information operations, and ongoing global campaigns, including in the former Soviet Union and Africa. Thank you for joining us today, Mrs. Bugaiova.
Thanks for having me.
You're also an author of the book How We Got Here with Russia, the Kremlin's worldview and the Putin's offset, the Kremlin geopolitical adaptations since 2014. You're a real expert on Russian policy, and your latest dispatch for the Institute for the Study of War, you say that Vladimir Putin is on his path to disappoint all elements of his power projection system. Why do you make such a conclusion? Has Putin become weaker compared to his positions 8 months ago, actually? And should we expect any split in Russian elites?
No, great question, and thanks for this discussion. I'll start by saying that Vladimir Putin's objectives regarding Ukraine remain the same. In fact, they have been the same for many years, and essentially we do not assess the potential for them to change. Even the battlefield setbacks that Russia is experiencing right now in Ukraine do not make him change that intent, and we see him doubling down on the maximalist objectives in Ukraine, which never been about NATO, never been about territories, it's always been about control. This presents a set of problems for him. First of all, he has a really big reality problem, because the gap between what he wants to accomplish and what Russia can do is actually not only growing, it's becoming very obvious to Putin's base. He's not trying to actually fix this gap fundamentally, because it requires 16 to 20 years of mistakes, not just 8 months of the past of this year. He's also not trying to shape or change the perception of the entire base. Instead, he's, as we discussed, focusing on very small subsets that are committed to this vision, either for ideological reasons or for practical reasons, in both the regime and the population. And that creates a set of problems for him. One, because he's leaning on the more extreme nationalist part. And one thing they care about is a total victory in Ukraine, which will be increasingly hard for Vladimir Putin to deliver, precisely because of the capability intent gap. He cannot solely rely on extreme nationalists. He also needs other parts of his base that are core, solidity key, that also want victory in Ukraine, but perhaps not at the expense of the entire Russian long-term capability. And he also has opportunity, diminishing value proposition to his entire base within the population. Final thing I will say is that, and I will really emphasize that it doesn't make him instantly vulnerable. It does create a major problem for him in the sense that he has to now balance not only conflicting objectives of winning Ukraine, preserving his regime, and preserving some of Russia's power, he also has to manage the conflicting parts of his base that align around one or the other objective.
Okay, and in this hard circumstances, after the 7 months of war, 1 month ago, Putin started a mobilization campaign to replenish Russian military forces in Ukraine. Can you say today that it was the right move from him? Does it work well for Russian army?
Yeah, I think we really need to put it in the context of this entire military campaign. Putin started with a big gap between what he wanted to do in Ukraine and how he resourced his military campaign in February of 2022. In fact, if we look even further back, Kremlin has been eroding Russia's capability for 20 years. It was just not as visible and obvious to, I think, everyone around the world and inside of Russia. So Putin invaded Ukraine with insufficient resources. Then he used those resources on limited gains, as we recall how much he expended, let's say, on his effort to seize Severodonetsk, right, or Mariupol. So there was a lot of pouring a lot of resources in pursuit of limited gains. Then Russian campaign exhausted its momentum in Donbass this summer, and Ukraine used the opportunity to launch a very planned and cohesive counteroffensive. So we're at this point where Russia actually exhausted a lot of its pre-postured resources. However, it still doesn't scale back on its maximalist objectives of controlling the entire Ukraine. So Putin is trying to use this mobilization to patch that gap. But the problem that it creates for Russia is that in the short term, and we assessed it actually when he announced the mobilization order, that it's not going to produce short-term battlefield effects because you can take as many people that doesn't turn them instantly into cohesive, combat-capable units, and yes, the train, equip, the entire throughput mechanism inside of Russia is suffering, and the bureaucracy, which is really important, inside of Russia is not prepared for this scale of mobilization. I want to be very clear that we should not make a mistake of thinking that Putin will not throw more and more people into the fight. He will, and actually many Russians will get in line, they will march obediently to fight and die in Ukraine. However, in the short term, Russia was not positioned to essentially absorb and process the scale of mobilization, and we see this on the battlefield that it's not generating the effect that they certainly wanted. We need to see whether they will actually try to fix some of these systematic challenges with training, equipping, integrated deployment forces, and whether that will have effect in 2023. But right now, Ukraine preserves the initiative on the battlefield, and it's a very critical moment for Ukraine to continue seizing on, precisely because Russia cannot fix their mobilization through problems in the short term, no matter what they do.
And during this last month, hundreds of thousands of men fled from Russia to neighboring countries, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Finland, and other ones. What would be the effect of this draft campaign, mobilization campaign on Russian society and economy if we just look broader, not only on the military efforts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in the short term, we should also not underestimate the ability of Russian society to normalize a new and worse reality each time Putin tightens the screws. In fact, he did this escalation letter against his own people over the past 20 years when each time he tightened his grip on power, he demanded more, he gave less. This is another iteration of that when his value proposition to them is diminishing, be it the promise of stability, be it the promise of great Russia, but he's demanding more and more on them. That said, his grip on power is still strong. I think there's still a lot of obedience within the Russian population, so we might not see any effect actually in the short term. I think we do see effect of Russian battlefield failures actually changing discussion and debate within the power circles and the society. Because one thing that we absolutely learned in the last 8 months that Russians do care about the idea of Great Russia. And Russian, especially the nationalist part of the base, did not react to atrocities that Russia committed in Ukraine as much. They did not even react to Russian casualties in this war. What they did react when Ukraine forced Russia to fail on the battlefield, be it withdrawal from Kyiv, sinking Moskva ship, the most recent wave of Russian operational defeats. So I think that is the true pressure, not necessarily the mobilization itself. In the long term, however, I think we will see a major transformation within Russia that's forced by this mobilization, and not necessarily in a good way. I think that system in motion, how it will shape, we'll know a bit later, but I think we are at the point where the gap between what Russia was trying to project and want to be and what they actually developed as capability over the past 20 years just does not matter. The void between that is abysmal, and the mobilization is only going to reinforce it. It will help Putin crystallize his regime around those in the population who will get in line and march, or those within the power who will support him for ideological or practical reasons. However, that moves Russia away and Putin further away from competence, from better knowledge, which is what they do need to essentially try, if they want to fix the situation on the battlefield, or at least attempt to. So I think long-term it's going to be a major driver of transformation inside of Russia, short-term less so.
Got it. And now there's a lot of comments, a lot of analysis on Lukashenko and his regime and Belarus and their role actually in this war against Ukraine. How high is the probability right now that Belarusian army will directly attack Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for this question. I think there are two big issues we're discussing. The fact that Belarus is the biggest untold story in this entire equation, in the sense that Russia's invasion of Ukraine a little bit outshined the fact that Putin has been trying and nearly established full control over Belarus over the past years. The Kremlin has invested billions of dollars, Putin's personal time, in that objective. But despite all of that, the Kremlin still isn't able to force Lukashenka to fully commit to fighting in this war. Now, again, let's make no mistake, Belarus is a co-belligerent of Russia in this war. It's a staging ground. It's providing Russia opportunity to deploy its forces from, to launch attacks, to strikes in Ukraine from. It is absolutely a co-belligerent in this war. However, even despite all the leverage that Putin has on Lukashenko and Russia has over Belarus, it really shows the limits of Russia's power, that it wasn't able to convince, force, or otherwise make Lukashenko fully commit forces into this war. I think it is unlikely from, in my assessment, that Lukashenko will do so at this point. Precisely because it is the dynamic between him and the population and their perception of this war is fundamentally different between Putin and his population and his regime. Belarusians do not want to fight this war. It is not their war. They don't have ideological or practical reasons that would make it that would have any upside in this endeavor. From the military standpoint, Russia could not advance and take Kyiv when it was at the strongest. Belarusians understand that, and I think they also understand that if they try to advance the scale, it will be tremendous casualties, massive body bags, and potentially a very limited gain. So I think Lukashenko will try to continue his dance of trying to create an illusion of a lot of action and some very concrete but limited support. But from my assessment, they are unlikely to enter the war substantially. I think we should not, though, be complacent, because I think Russia absolutely wants to use Belarus as a way to stretch Ukrainian forces. So that scenario is still in play, and at some point Russia may use it. However, what they will accomplish in the battlefield will be limited, and that assessment will factor in, I think, Belarusian decision to whether to go in or not.
Understand. Let us talk a little bit about the sanctions effect. We have an opinion of the Estonian Defense Minister Hanno Pevkur, he believes that sooner or later Russia will restore its military potential despite the sanctions. Pevkur said that he doesn't feel very optimistic that US sanctions on the Russian military industry will significantly prevent future Russians' attack on Ukraine. What do you think about this effect of sanctions on the Russian military, economy and society? It's different impacts, surely.
Yeah. So I think we should go back to the point about the intent. I think Russia's intent regarding Ukraine won't change, and in fact, very likely Putin and even his successor, regardless of what they will accomplish in this phase of the war, will try to pursue the intent to control Ukraine, and then also, frankly, to link their gains in Ukraine and Belarus, which I think was the plan from the beginning. So if given an opportunity, they will absolutely try to restore Russia's military might and military-industrial complex. There are several problems here. The first one, if we talk about several aspects of capability, you have manpower, you have the defense-industrial complex. In terms of the manpower, Russia has exhausted a lot of its best and most willing to fight in the first 8 months of this war. Once again, Putin will continue mobilizing and training and throwing bodies at the problem. I have no doubt about that. But it's very different than training military capability. And the biggest bottleneck here is also officer cadre. It's one of the strongest, I think, advantages actually that Ukraine has is the mission command and initiative on the ground and the ability to essentially be innovative on the battlefield. And that does require a very different type and cadre of officers to provide that agility. Russia and its officer cadre will be an increasing bottleneck in the manpower component of the capability. So I think it actually will take years to replenish Russian officer cadre if they ever can recover it to that level. So that's one. Number two, in terms of the military-industrial complex, I think it is actually a bit of a myth that sanctions did not work on Russia. In fact, I think they did not work on changing Russia's intent, but that should never have been the goal. Frankly, the intent should always have been to change their capability to act on this intent. And I think we do see the effects of cumulative effect of sanctions over years, combined with, frankly, Russian own competence in managing their economy and the defense-industrial complex. In the sense that they do have limited ability to launch precision-guided weapon systems. It's hard to say whether they're running out of them or not, but it's a limited resource which they are using, actually not judiciously at very limited gains, as we see with the attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure and civilian targets that actually don't produce meaningful change for Russia on the battlefield. They are intended to produce psychological effect from Russian perspective, but they don't produce that one either because it's not really affecting Ukraine's will fight. So I do think that Russia will have issues with their ability to create advanced weapon systems, and the advanced weapon systems really matter in this war, be it the precision-guided strike capabilities, the whole conversation about the drones and the fact that now they have to rely on partner forces in that regard. And yes, I think the West should be absolutely laser focused on making sure that Russia cannot get any empowerment through Western technology or any foreign technology, as well as cannot circumvent the existing control. So I think I would disagree with I agree fully with the assessment that Russia will try to reproduce its capability at full, but I think sanctions work. I think they're not sufficient yet, and the sanctions on the defense-industrial complex need to be stepped up, and they will be probably the most important in the next several years. Precisely because of the dynamics we discussed.
And what about another threat by which Putin tries to intimidate the West. This week, the Defense Secretary of the United Kingdom, Ben Wallace, and his colleague, the Armed Forces Minister James Heappey from the United Kingdom, flew to Washington, D.C. for emergency talks with U.S. counterparts and a growing concern that Vladimir Putin could launch a nuclear strike. Considering this, what can we say about the probability of a future Russian nuclear attack, and how probable or possible is that catastrophic move from the Kremlin?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we cannot rule out a possibility of Putin deciding at some point to use a tactical nuclear weapon. Precisely because, he is on an escalation ladder where he tried, from his perspective, a limited military operation in 2014, went to the full invasion. That did not produce the outcome he sought. He's trying to patch that gap through mobilization, which I think is unlikely to produce the result he seeks. I'm not talking about some limited gains, I'm talking about his actual objective of controlling Ukraine. So we cannot rule out that at some point he may decide that that's the path to go. However, there are several very concrete realities here. First, the effect of such an attack and the intended purpose of such an attack would likely be to break Ukraine's will to fight. And in my assessment, even that will not break Ukraine's will to fight, because Putin made it abundantly clear to Ukrainians now running Ukraine that alternative to fighting is actually worse, right? It's Bucha, it's Izum, it's essentially life in Russian occupation. And as horrible as it sounds, Putin has shown to Ukrainians that there are worse things than nuclear weapons. So I think it will not have an effect on the Ukrainian will to fight, or at least it's unlikely to. The second, of course, is about potential use of nuclear weapon to degrade Ukrainian military capability. And here there are also caveats. Russia will need to use likely several tactical nuclear weapons to try to achieve that objective, which will also then present actually major issues for Russia's own ability to operate on a nuclear battlefield, for which Russia has been technically trained and equipped for. But we've seen how short they have fallen on every other training and equipment, and I think that's a major consideration. Finally, I think it's Ukraine's decision and choice only whether to continue running that risk. So far, Ukraine has decided that it is. The first day Ukraine chose to fight and push back against Russia, it has been running that risk. So it all comes down to whether at some point Ukraine chooses that it's not, but I don't expect it will, precisely because Putin framed this war as an existential war for Ukraine.
All right, and this existential war, this full-scale war, continues for 8 months for now already. The winter is coming, and the hard times for the European Union countries are ahead, actually, without Russian gas. How determined are the Western countries now to support Ukraine during the next few months, during the next year, actually, in this war against Russia?
Yeah. Look, I think there are two centers of gravity in this war. The first one is Ukraine's will to fight, and the second is Western support. If those two factors persist, Russia is unlikely to achieve its objectives in Ukraine. Kremlin realizes that, and one of the things that Putin is trying to target is precisely the unity between Ukraine and its Western partners. Russia had failed to do so and create friction between the U.S. and Ukraine. Russia is thus focusing on what Russia perceives as a weaker link in this equation, which is Europe. However, I think to this point, the West has made the right choice of supporting Ukraine, and it's not only because Ukraine's fighting relentlessly an existential war, and defending Ukraine and Western values in a very inspiring way. It is also because it's a fight for civilizational values. I think that's one of the reasons why the people around the world, not just governments, people around the world supported Ukraine, because it's a choice between Ukraine emerging as sovereign or us going back to the Hobbesian world, and the sort of the world in which countries can redraw each other's borders by force. So I think there's another driving force of Western support is the populations. And the values alignment that is not that easy to erode, even if political winds can change. And I think it's actually a really key point. The final one, Russia makes it abundantly easy to continue countering them, because they're failing on the battlefield and they're using increasingly terrorist tactics, strikes on civilians. The threats we're now seeing in Kherson, the region with the dam. I think Putin is also helping the West continue supporting by how brutal and terrorist methods Russia is deploying. I do think winter will be hard. I do think there is enough of understanding that it will be hard, that both Europe and Ukraine will survive this winter in terms of energy. So I think the goal should be to make sure that unity is preserved through that. And at that time, Russia's capability will be in a very different place.
Let us hope it all will go fine, will go well, and the unity will be established and will be preserved in Europe, and our allies will be still on our side when spring comes. Thank you so much, Nataliya, for this conversation. Thank you so much for your bright answers. It was a big pleasure for me and an honor for me to have this dialogue with you today. Thank you for being with us.
No, thank you for great questions and everything you do.
And thank you, our dear audience. Our guest today was Nataliya Bugaiova from the Institute for the Study of War, and we hope to see you soon on our channel with our new guest.